Hello everyone, I'm Ilish, I'm an architect, and today we will talk about how you can do the renders within ARCHLine.XP. We have a built-in rendering engine, and today we will talk about that, how to use that, and what sort of key factors you need to consider looking at when you would like to balance between efficiency and good quality renders. So we will go through all the settings, and I will also show you 5 key factors that are very important to be able to understand what happens when you do the renders and why those things happen in a certain way as you experience them. And today's project that you can see on screen are the models that we used previously with the lighting. It was the previous session. My colleague talked about the importance of lighting and what sort of things you can do with the software. He created lamps and he distributed all the light sources along the ceiling and everywhere in this building. I'm having a certain version of that project, so we will have a similar result, but today we will focus on not only on the lighting, we will talk about a little bit of that, but we will talk about other key factors such as the materials, the settings, and the complexity of the model itself. So I mentioned that there are those key factors, so let's see what are the key factors to performance when you do the render. So the first thing is obviously your computer. Your computer, what you use, what sort of hardware you have in your computer has a certain computing power. It's the raw hardware performance what we talk about, and this time when we are talking about with the built-in rendering engine that we ship with the software, that is the CPU, the central processing unit of your computer, and the memory, the RAM. Those are the two key elements of rendering, and everything that is calculated with this renderer are going through those two hardwares. You can imagine the CPU as the neck of the bottle. So you have a larger neck, a wider neck. You can pour the water faster into that bottle, and you can imagine the memory as the bottle itself. So should you have larger amount of memory, you can pour more water into that. You can render more complex scenes to talk about the model itself. So the hardware is important. Currently, the GPU is doing nothing with the render. So let's make clear of that GPU is for what you see now on screen, which is a certain render, but it is a flat shading. It is for modeling. So your GPU, your video card, your graphics card is working with the model when you are working with that, and when you do the renders with the built-in renderer, you are using your CPU and your RAM. Okay, so the following thing is the settings. That we will cover all the settings and you will understand what setting does what and how you can control what happens. And actually, when we are talking about rendering, the currency that we use to pay for the performance is time. So I will tell you what are key factors for balancing with the time. Usually I can say that when you would like to achieve a better quality, you will pay with time. So to be able to understand how that connects to the settings is essential, especially when you have a very short time to deliver your project. The following thing that I will also talk about today is the quality of materials. Now, I'm talking about quality of materials in terms of reflectivity, reflections of the materials. Everything that surrounds us, even this backdrop or even my t-shirt, is somehow reflective in reality. Now for rendering, we have materials that are kind of matte, we have materials that are much more reflective or something like that. I will show you how to apply those materials and how to tweak those. Basically, I can say that whenever you have the materials and you have them reflected the perfect way, even mud-like surfaces, then you will have a very good result. But the situation is a little bit more complex than that. You will need to focus on the most important materials first, and then talk about the rest. So I will show you in practice how that works. And also, just as we covered it yesterday or the previous session, lights are key factors for rendering. Rendering is like virtually seeing a virtual scene in front of you. Just in this case, when we talk about rendering, we are talking about ray traced rendering. That means we have quite a lot of bouncing lights and all sort of reflections all around us, and also light sources. So the more light sources you have in your scene, the slower the rendering will be, even if you have a very powerful computer. And when we are talking about lights, small point-like lights are kind of cheap to render. Those are not too CPU intensive. But when you use sort of hidden lights or decorative lights, just as you could see on this photograph in the background, those are costly. So you should consider keeping them just as much as you need to use them, as it was. As it was covered in the previous session. So lights are key. We covered that. We had a whole session about that. I won't talk about too much about that situation. And finally, the fifth key factor is the model complexity. And the model complexity is measured in a number of surfaces. When you download something from Google Warehouse, you have that count over there, which tells you how many surfaces you have, and even the software, I mean, ARCHLine itself will let you know when you download something and it is too complex. Sometimes you don't have a choice, but many times you do have, and you need to take care of the balance of your model. If you see that during work it is kind of cloggy and it's not working smooth already, you know that the render will be also slow, so you need to remove things that you don't want to see, and I will show you a good practice for that, how to do that. So these are the key factors, the 5 key factors: the hardware, the settings, the material, the lighting, and the model complexity. So let's see in practice how that works. So this is the model that I've talked about, and to be able to do our first renders, I will just go and let's see what sort of views we have. I think I will start with this one here inside. And now what we see here is kind of the final version of this model. This is where we would like to get to. But as I mentioned, you should be able to focus on what's important, what's the most important for the current situation that you are looking for. And when you start rendering, the first thing that you need to set up properly, besides the lighting, is the materials themselves. So to be able to do that, you need to be able to remove things that are not necessary now. All the tiny details are not necessary. We are looking for the large surfaces, for the wall, the ceiling, and the pocket, and this is what I only would like to see. So for that, I will use the layer system of the software. So I will just go back and see what we have on the 2D. So the project itself is not too complex, but what I show you now works for larger projects as well. Because when you have the 2D and you create your layers, I mean, the software automatically generates layers, but what you would like to optimize your workflow, you will create your own layers, and you will put different versions of the layouts and everything else into certain layers. And in case of rendering and in case of visual design, you would like to be able to remove, for example, the furnishing in one step. You would like to remove the decoration in one step, and so on. So for that, I have an idea here. If you open the Layer Properties Manager and you enable the use layers in this project, as you can see, we have, for this customer area, we have 5 different layers. Now, the recommendation that we used to say is that you should at least create 3 different layers for each and every room when you are optimizing for visuals. One is for the furnitures, and I mean, those are the large parts, the cabinets and the furnishing items themselves, like coach, sofa, and so on. And the other one, so that was the furniture. The other one are the decorative items, like those tiny things, and even some of these computers and keyboards, mobile phones, and everything else. Those are supporting actors of this model. We need them, but not at the first stage. And finally, one layer should be at least for the lighting. Now in this case the designer created 3 different layers because he wanted to control them separately, but if you have at least 1 layer by room for the lighting of that room, then you are good to go already, and you can of course make it even more details, just as you can see in this case. So 3 layers: furniture, decorative items, and lighting. Now, if I would like to remove things then I don't want to see them, I can disable the visibility here, but I would like to show you an even faster way. I like that the tool to use in these situations, and that is the layer walk. If you click on the layer walk, you kind of literally walk between layers. You can just quickly click on the layer and see what happens on that layer. You can filter to another layer, see what happens on that layer, and if you click on one layer and hold the Ctrl key on your keyboard and click on the second one, you can just enable the visibility of 2 layers or 3 layers or as many as you want. You can even actually click and drag if you would like to select multiple things, or you can just use the select it first and shift select the last one. That is the same thing, just as in case you are selecting files, for example, in Windows Explorer. So these are all Windows standards controls. So you just click here and hold Control, click on the slab, and then you have only the slabs. The ceilings are also covered here, and the walls themselves. So if you click OK, you can see that narrowed down, filtered, simpler version of your model. And if you would like to see that in the 3D as well, not just on the 2D, you need to rebuild your 3D, and that is with this little 3D hammer, that's just as we call it, to be able to, now we are able to focus on the wall surfaces, the ceiling surfaces, and the flooring itself, so nothing blocks our view. We have a clear visual of all of these surfaces, so we will see how those happen. But first, before I do that, yesterday or the previous session about lighting, we talked about the artificial lighting. We have quite a few of those here, but we did not cover perhaps the sunlight. So and that is also important when you do the rendering. So I am willing to talk about, a little bit about that, how that works. Now, if you would like to set up the sunline, the first thing is that if your model is georeferenced and it is well aligned to the north, then you are good to go already. But you need to be able to determine the calendar date and the time when you would like to see the sunlight affecting your model. So you need to go to View, and you can select any of those options. And now I'm focusing on the shadow simulation because that is one of the quickest and fastest ways to do that. So if you click OK, then you can see this shadow simulation, and in the background we can see how the sunlight affects the model. Now we are outside, so we cannot see everything that is inside, but at least where the door is open, we can look into and see what happens. Now this is not a rendering, this is just a simple visual, but it already gives us a good visual on what will happen. So let's set up, for example, this is on the northern part of the globe. So when I set up a date around somewhere in winter, let's go October 7th, and set up a time, for example, during somewhere in 1330. And let's just hit OK, and I actually go inside because I also would like to show you what happens inside. So when I turn this on again, we can see that the sunlight is coming inside the model. And well, this is something that you would like to consider balancing with, because the sunlight is very, very powerful. Even if you have a lot of light sources all around you, those are not having enough power to kind of suppress the sunlight. And even if they do, the sun, as you will see, the sunlight is having a very, very important effect on your rendering. So you should consider whether you would like to let the sunlight in and bright up the areas, sometimes risking burning out surfaces because it's too powerful, or you can just select another date and time. And it's an important thing here. If you would like to create a night scenery, you need to move the sun below the horizon, either by using this or by using the time slider. So in that case, you will have a night scene. So I think I will just set up a different time somewhere around summer. While we are on this northern part of the globe, it means that we will have a kind of high-pitched version of the sun angle will be quite high, so I'm willing to use that because the sunlight itself is not coming into the model too much. So let's say okay, and then the shading disappeared automatically, but this doesn't mean that the sun is off. It is just a visual representation temporarily, and when you disable this option it's not shown, but the render already knows what to do with that. Talking about the rendering settings are very, very important. Let me just talk to you about that, and in the meantime I'm looking for whether everything is okay. I think everything is okay with this session today already. So let's go back here and see what happens with the rendering settings. What sort of rendering settings are we talking about? The rendering settings are here in the view and rendering, and you have a few options for rendering, and also you can find that same golden globe here. If you click here, you have all the same options. Now, last time my colleague used the integrated rendering. That is integrated in terms of how it behaves inside the software. It acts and behaves as a drawing, so it will be in a window inside ARCHLine. And today I'm using a standalone rendering. First I will use the real time, so you will see what happens directly. And then I will show you how to turn real-time renderings into final renders. So the first thing about the rendering is the resolution and the render quality. Now, when we do the renders, resolution is key for the speed of rendering. I told you that I will talk about what sort of settings and how do they affect rendering, and resolution affects rendering time a lot. So when you do the renders for yourself, not for your client, you should not go with high resolutions. Now, for example, talking about the widescreen resolutions that you can select here, this is kind of a work, a study resolution. It's for yourself. When you do the rendering, you will see all the reflections, all the lights, even on the small version of the rendering, but it will render way faster than you would render, for example, a widescreen full HD, or even talking about 4K that is even longer. So for yourself, you will always render images in lower resolution to have a much faster render, but for your clients you will go with either this or something larger, because they will likely see your images not only on their mobile phones but also on large screen TVs in their homes. So to avoid having blurry, not good quality images in terms of resolution, you should render larger resolutions for them. And also you can set up user-defined size. In that case you can type any sort of resolution. And talking about this, I wanted to show you something about how the ray tracing itself works, because that is how it is connected with the settings that we are using here. So ray tracing, how does that work? Ray tracing this is a very simple concept of ray tracing from Wikipedia. And it actually tells you how the rendering works. Now, the image and the camera are the things that are this represents what we see. The image has a certain resolutions. Those are those little squares, as you can see. So as you can see, the larger the resolution, the more squares you have, the more calculations the software has to do, because the software actually calculates each and every pixels, what the color of that pixel is. And using this kind of filter that we have in front of us in a certain resolution, we see the virtual world. And if we actually, while I'm talking about as a renderer, I'm imagining myself as I am the renderer, so I'm seeing the world through these tiny dots, and I'm shooting rays to the world and see what it hits, whether it hits a scene object, it hits the building itself, it hits my desk, which I represented in my interior, or it hits the sunlight itself. So this is how the renderer works. It shoots rays, millions of rays, so that's why it takes longer to calculate a version of a ray traced image than a line drawing, which we had before. So it calculates all these details, for each and every pixel. So again, coming back to the resolution, this is why the resolution is important. So you should not have a large resolution when you work for yourself, but when you do the rendering, you need to increase the resolution and do full HD or even larger images for your clients. Okay, rendering quality. Now, real-time draft is selected, and it is because I have selected that option when I started the command here. I will tell you what the difference are between exterior, interior, and high detail, and what use they do have. And now we can talk about the sunlight settings, the visualize the light sources, enable artificial lights, and enable sunlight options. Now, visualizing the light sources, it is a kind of a heritage option from previous versions of ARCHLine from 2015 or even before. This actually generates tiny kind of bulbs or so to the sources of where you have your lights themselves inside the fixture itself. But for the modern renderer that we have now in the software, it's not necessary. So basically, I recommend you to turn this off. But if you would like to test it, just go and do, and you will see what it has, what it offers. But it is not necessary for a well done lamp already. So you don't need to turn it on. Keep it off. Enable artificial lights. Artificial lights are all the lamps. So obviously, if you would like to see them, you need to turn this option on. If you have all your light sources on and turned on, and you disable this option, it's like a very large switch for all your light sources in your scene that you can use to turn off the artificial lights in one step. And the following thing is the sunlight. It is the same thing for the sunlight. Sunlight is a light source itself. You can disable the sunlight, but keep in mind that if you disable the sunlight, it is not creating a night scene. I will show you that. It is simply disabling the sunlight. Bump mapping, I will talk about that in a later session when we will see the materials, because this is a material setting. You should turn this on because it will give you a very nice and detailed surface. And also the background. Backgrounds are important because you can either have a plain white background, which I have now behind me, or you can actually have a photograph or anything like that, or even you can have panoramas. So if you go with a panoramic 360 background, you can select any of those backgrounds that we offer with the software, or should you have any sort of HDR background. I mean, the file format, it is .hdr. In that case, you can select it here. I think I will just simply go with an image, and I will use this background image with the city sky cloudy, and this is what I will use. Now, in case of using background images, you should keep in mind that the resolution of those background images should be at least the same or larger than the scene that you are, the final resolution of your render. If it's smaller, then the background will be blurry, so you should avoid that. And okay, so now I have an image. I can also specify my own photograph, which I took on the side. If you do renders as I do now, which is kind of an easy to understand render for the clients, when your eye level and the target level where you look at, it's just the same level. So as you can see, all the verticals are nice verticals, not any sort of certain slanted angle because of the distortion of the perspective. Then you should apply similar backgrounds where you can see the horizon is in the middle or around the middle of your photograph. And of course, you can change the brightness of this background. Should it be too bright or dark, you can change it. Well, in this specific case, looking from here to there, we won't see this background, but should we have a mirror surface here, we will just as well see it, because we have a glass background behind us now, so it will be reflected here. Okay, so, and one another thing here is the rendering frame, which you can turn on and off here. Or you can use this option here, the render frame on and off, and you might notice something appearing here. And it seems that there is nothing of a big change here, but it's simply because my screen, what I see in my workspace, is too narrow for that wide angle. So I need to kind of hide this to be able to show you what happens. So this is the rendering frame. So now the software tells me that whenever I render my renders in this certain resolution or anything similar to this in ratio, this is exactly what I will see. Everything inside this area is what I will see. So this is a kind of good helper when you are looking for a good scene where you're looking for the best shot when you would like to see a tiny bit of the table here and I don't know anything else in the center. So this is what we have set up, and now we will start doing the rendering. So I will just use the same standalone real-time draft. Just in this case, I started it from here, not from here. The settings are the same, and I will go. Yeah, well, I have not set up perhaps this image. Yeah, this should be cloudy. Yeah, and start rendering. Okay, so the rendering now, because I have selected a standalone rendering, it starts as it looks like a standalone application, and it really behaves as well. So in this case, you can I don't know, put it to the other screen if you have multiple screens or something like that. So it's in some sort of situations it's easier to handle. And now this render was done in literally no seconds, because it is a very small resolution and it is only a draft render. But we already see whether we have our light sources turned on or not, because we cannot see those cones on the wall surfaces. We can suspect that perhaps I have forgotten turning on this light source here, which is the plane ceiling itself, and I actually have an enable light source option here, which is turned off, so that's why I cannot see that. So if I enable this option and I go back to the render, which is here, I can see that. And as you can see, the light balance is already changed a little bit, because we have something in the render, which most of the renders actually do have. It is called a tone mapper, and you can imagine a real world tone mapper. If you think of your iris, that is a tone mapper. If it actually reacts to the light conditions, and it opens in darker areas and it closes brighter areas, so it controls what sort of amount of light sources you will see. So the image that you see around will most of the time won't burn out, so you will see the world around you. So this is what happens in the render as well. So as you can see, now we have all those nice light cones, and I would like to show you one another thing before I'm talking about these effects here, and that is that now I have turned this on. I actually have sunlight outside, but if I want, I can test whether this rendered image looks better with the current sunlight settings or without those sunlight settings. So in that case, I can go to the details, and as you can see, these are all the same details. You can, even when you already have the render in front of you, you can change those settings. You can disable the sunlight and see what happens then. So it looks like it is nighttime now because the light conditions changed. It is not. It is like a very cloudy day when the sunlight is above the cloud, so it has a very soft light and very dim light effect on the world. So this is what we have now. I could dial down the date and time to create a night scene, but this is what I wanted to show you. So whether you do have night or sunlight or not, it affects the light conditions, and it also affects the graininess of your image. This is also important. If you do not have sunlight turned on, most of the time you will have more grainy images on lower quality settings. I mean, I'm talking about these. I will show you what those mean. So in that case, you can increase the rendering settings, but I will cover that a little bit later. But now we are fine with that. We are not looking for clear images for draft renders. We are looking for reflections, lights, whether they are on, and surfaces themselves. So now that I can see all the surfaces around me, I can perhaps I can also close this renderer, and I can tell the software, okay, let's change these shadow options and go with a different light setting. In that case, I can just close it and start it again. I just wanted to double check whether I have July, the setting that I'm willing to work with, and then I can just restart it again. The software remembers the settings. You can start rendering again, and there you go. You will have this render very fast. Now, what I see here is a kind of mud surface, and it is because I did not talk about the render styles yet. And render styles are key factor in the software because those affect how your materials look like. And those are actually here in the left hand side, the design center. And by the way, sometimes if you accidentally close the design center or anything like that, it is a common mistake for beginners and even for other ones. When I sometimes do that by accident. You can just go and enable everything as it was before using the user interface, reset interface to factory default, and then you will have everything as it was before. So should you not find that what I'm looking for now, you just use this option and you will see. And then now I'm using the catalog. Now in the catalogs you have material catalogs, object catalogs, and you have actually render styles. Render styles are ceiling, chrome, curtain, wall, and everything like that. Those are kind of material presets. And let me show you what that makes. I mean, I have a ceiling here, and when I click and drag this option here and I release and I click on this surface, it actually did something, but I don't see the result here because this is for the rendering. It changed how the ceiling behaves. It changed how the ceiling looks like. Now, before I show you what the rendering result is, I will change the wall and I will change the pocket as well. So I'm looking for something that is called wall. Okay, so these are obviously wall surfaces. I need to use the wall option here. And as you can see, it looks like this wall is kind of a material because it has a brick texture, but it will not change how it looks like. So I just click and drag, and it won't change the texture. When I click here, it kind of changed the brightness of this surface. And if I click here as well, you can see that something has changed, but not the texture. And it actually changes the reflectivity and all sorts of other real-world physical values of your model. So let's see what the result is after I use the pocket, because that will be the most visible part of our model now. So I just click and drag and release and click here. And as you can see, it will be reflective. And let's see what that does with our model. So now we can see that, well, I think I need to dial down the exposure. I will talk about the effects, but I think the exposure is just too much now. So something like that. And as you can see, now the whole light scene is also changed, because now when the light hits the surface, it is much more bright, especially the ceiling. The ceiling is that sort of ceiling rendering style that I used is tailored for that. It is making the ceiling brighter than normal, which is what your clients will expect for the renders. They don't want to see the gray ceiling that it really is in reality. If you see it on a photograph, they would like to see something brighter, so you can just apply it. And the same goes for the walls. And when I apply the pocket setting to the pocket texture, or the pocket material, whatever I had before, it is kind of reflective. We can barely see. You can handle this content as a drawing. You can move it holding down the scroll wheel and moving the mouse, and you can zoom in and out. So this is how you can handle it. And if I zoom in a little bit, we can kind of barely see a dim reflectivity of that material. So as you can see, pockets are set to be reflective a little bit. And this already gives us a lot of detail. When we will have those furniture sitting on this ceiling, those will have that nice contact reflectivity and contact shadow, which makes them really being there. And if you would use a matte surface, which renders way faster, but it will be flat. So I would tell you that when you are focusing on the most important materials, I mean the dominant materials of your model, those are usually the ceiling, the wall surfaces, and the flooring, and obviously the glass surfaces of the openings of your model. Then you should make them reflective. It will slow down the render, of course, more than using a matte surface, but it will be much more realistic. Okay, so let's see how I can customize it. If I don't like how reflective it is, I would like to make it a little bit more high polished or change the settings. How can I do that? In case of controlling the materials, in customizing the material, which I already have in front of me, I can just right click on any of the surfaces and click on Find Material. Now the Find Material option finds the material, exposes its texture, its size, its rendering style. I can change the rendering style even from here, and I can just scroll down and see its brightness, its reflectivity, its blurriness, and so on. So let's see what happens if I dial up the reflection to something high as, I don't know, for example 70%, and let's just go back and check what happened. Now it's more reflective, but it has no clear reflection, and the clear reflection, it is kind of depending on the porosity of your material, how grainy your material is. If it's high polished, it has less blurriness for the reflection. So if I would like to create a high polished version of this floor, I just dial down this blurriness to 0, and then I go back here, and now it's much more reflective. This is even not still a perfect mirror, because I actually have bump mapping applied here, as you can see it on the left hand side. Bump mapping is making those kind of tiny, you know, bumps of the surface that comes from the texture. In this case, the software is able to calculate the bumpiness of your surface based on the texture. It looks at the bright and dark pixels, and it handles them as higher and lower areas. This is an automatic system, which is very, very convenient. But if you don't want to use the automatic surface definition, you can just go here and select any sort of other material type. Even you can browse for your own normal map, which someone else designed for you, or you can do that. Then you can just apply that. I won't go this deep now because this is a starter session for the rendering, but you can even control that. Now I changed the reflectivity of the surface, and I changed the blurriness. But if I would like to have a much more realistic pocket, not very high polished version, in that case I just dial this up somewhere around perhaps 20, and I will test the render, and I see the result is okay. I think this is much better. It has its own glossiness, kind of blurred glossiness, but I like that. I will keep this, and later I can still tweak it. But the most important thing is that you should tweak these materials without the other things occluding your view. You should clear the view just as I did before, removing unnecessary parts, setting up the ceiling, setting up the wall surfaces and the pocket, and then put the other things inside. So this is what I will do now. I think now I'm done with this. I could further tweak all the rest of the materials, but this is the same step that I would do for each and every, so I won't repeat myself. One thing I would like to show you, because now what I did not change the material. I simply I did not switch materials. I changed the material which I already had on the surface. But what if I would like to switch this material to another one? For example, this. I would like to test whether it looks much better with I don't know, a glass surface or a mirror that I already have in my libraries. So in that case, what I will do, I just go to the home screen, and I go to the materials library, and I go and find something perhaps in the glass and mirror, and I just look for any sort of mirrors here. Like, let's see this. I would like to use this turquoise mirror, and I just apply it on the surface. And this is also a click and drag command, but it is a little bit different than the render styles, because then you have a few options what you would like to do with this material. And now I would like to change it on this surface only. So I select this last option. I click here, and then now this is reflective also. So what I see here, I can see the background, as I mentioned before, because we have a clear glass surface behind us, so we can see through that. And so in that case, even though you don't see directly the background, it could be important as a supporting actor for your model, because it gives a lot of detail into the model. So I actually don't want to make this as a reflective surface, so I just remove this setting. I just disable this and go back to the previous setting. And then I would like to bring in more and more details. So how to do that? You need to go back to the 2D, and you don't even have to switch drawings. It's just important to make it active, and then you can go into the layer settings. And why it's important to switch back to 2D? Because if you are still in the 3D, if you click here, you will see only 3 layers, because you actually now in the model you only have 3 layers, because you didn't build the content of the rest of the layers. So if you go back to the 2D, you will always see all your layers, and based on those layers you can build what you would like to see in the 3D, and only those layers will be available in the 3D. So that's important. So now I'm going back to the 2D, and I'm enabling the furniture. For example, this is what I do. I just hit Control. I'm holding Control, and I click in here and say okay, and just rebuild the 3D. So this is what we have here. Okay, so now let's see what the content is now here. Now, as you can see, this render, what I'm using, this is real-time draft. This is continuously trying to keep track of what I change during even rebuilding the model, moving things around, changing their materials. Should it not happen anymore, because sometimes this renderer just simply loses connection with the software, because it is a very, very CPU intensive process, and if your computer is not powerful enough, it will just say, okay, I'm terminating this because I don't want to kill the computer. So if that happens, no worries. You only need to close this, say yes, okay, and then restart it again and say, okay, standalone rendering again, and start it again. You will go back where you left off. So now I'm having this view, and yeah, I need to dial this down, but I did that before already, so I will talk about this a little bit later. So now when I would like to change the materials, for example, the secondary dominant surfaces now for me are these surfaces here. Well, those are looking cool, so I won't change the paintings, but I would like to change these white furniture surfaces, and I would like to test how they look like. And so I go back to the home screen and I say, okay, render styles, and let's go with the metal first. So I think a metal will look cool with this. So this is a metal surface. Apply it here, and I applied it on the material, not on a surface. So wherever else I use that material, it is automatically visualized. So I'm coming back here. Well, maybe it's a bit too much, or I can tweak it, or I can just go with, for example, a marble or anything else, and let's see how that looks like. And if I like this much better, well, I think it has a nice glossy surface, especially when I dial this down, and we can see how that looks like. So I will go with this one. So this is what you will end up with, changing the materials, and still you have the option to fine tune whatever else you would like to fine tune with that material. Okay, so let's bring in a little bit more details. So the second step is bringing in details, test them, whether they look like you wanted, and then when they are, then just bring in more details, more details, more details. You will see that rendering will gradually slowing down because you will have more surfaces, and this is where the fifth key point, the fifth key factor, the complexity of the model comes in. Whenever you turn in more and more details into the model, it will slow down the rendering process because this virtual eye, the camera, the renderer itself will see more surfaces. So when I'm bringing in more details, it happens the same way. I'm going back to the 2D, and I'm again using the layer walk. I like to use this, so I'm just turning on the decorative items, and yeah, I think this is enough for now. I'm saying okay, and let's just rebuild the 3D and see what happens then. I will see all those computers, keyboards, and everything else in this showroom already appearing. And finally, at the end, I will turn on the lights as well. But this is actually what I will end up with. And what I would like to do is that, yeah, well, this is what I mentioned, that now, unfortunately, the renderer lost the connection. No worries. You can you can try re-render it. Sometimes this helps. But if it's not making the thing that you want to, then you just close it and go back to the 3D and just do this standalone rendering now real time, and we will talk about the rest later. So I just started again, and you will see this is kind of a work render, so it's not a large resolution. It's only 800 by some, and so it takes not too long to render, but it takes a little longer now because I have a little bit more details in the render. So now I think now it's good to talk about the effects that you can set up even during rendering. So if your rendering takes longer, and large renders will take much longer than this one, then you still have time to set up the brightness, the contrast, the saturation, and everything else for your render. Now, I recommend you to always start with the exposure. If your exposure is not correct, you won't do anything nice with the brightness, contrast, and everything else. If it's not correct, just as in case of photograph, if you have an overexposed photo, it is really difficult to create a cool, nice image out of that. So first, set up the exposure. In case of interior scenes, most of the time you need to increase the exposure, but sometimes when your scene has enough light sources already and it is very, very bright, perhaps you need to dial it down. I'm highlighting this because now we are rendering interiors, and when we talk about exteriors, that's another topic. I will talk about this at the end. You will need to handle this a little bit different. So exposure is correct. Now, setting up the exposure is finding white. If you feel whites are correct, then exposure is okay. You should try to avoid burnout surfaces as much as possible. If you still do have too much, perhaps you should consider changing the light scene. Perhaps some of your lights are too bright, but something like this is, I think, correct. We did not lose the details still. of this detail, but we only have a very few parts burn out, and actually I need those here because this represents how bright those areas are. So I'm fine with this. Then I can focus on brightness, contrast, and the rest. Brightness is something that the difference between brightness and exposure. We can consider that exposure is like opening the iris, opening the aperture of your photo machine, and it controls how much light your eye and in this case the renderer gets. So it sets up the overall light amount. Now brightness, on the other hand, it is doing something which you could do in, for example, Photoshop or something else, just it's integrated here. It is actually making all the pixels brighter or all the pixels darker. Now the reason why you should not use it too much, because as you can see it has a negative effect. When you use it with a too high value, it is actually washing out the colors, and you don't want that. So you should always perhaps fine-tune brightness and contrast and the rest of these, but not too much. So you just handle it the way you want, and as you see that, well, now this is a little bit better, then you should also control the contrast, because once you change the brightness, you should kind of compensate this negative effect with the contrast as well, to make this kind of washed out flat effect of brightness with the contrast a little bit. It's, again, if you use too much of that, you won't end up with anything good. Now the reason why you still can control it in much higher areas, because this is one sort of light condition, and you can do many different type of renders, night scenes and as well. So in that case, the contrast and the brightness is something that you will change a little bit more different. Saturation changes how saturated your image is, and if you change brightness, you can kind of compensate that color washing by adding a little bit more saturation, and actually your clients will expect more vividity in your renders as well. So you need to add a little bit more of the saturation usually than what is kind of expected normal. But again, if you just dial this up, it will be kind of more cartoon-like. If you would like to go for that effect, you can of course do that. But again, I think the golden rule here is to do it, but not too much. Don't overdo it. And shadows, midtones, and highlights. Those are actually, well, shadows are dark tones more like, because if I dial this up, as you can see, all dark areas are even darker. So it's not necessarily only the shadows, it is for the dark areas. So you can actually make dark areas more strong, more effective on the render. It's kind of a selective contrast. You can also do something similar with the midtones and something with the highlights. Now highlights are these areas that we already have experienced as very bright areas. So in this case, perhaps I don't need to change that, but again, you can change that. The white balance is for kind of a mood effect as well, because if you use a white balance which is kind of cool white balance, cold colors, then you can set up a feeling for the same render. I didn't change the sunlight outside, but I can set up a scene looking like it is, for example, somewhere in Sweden in wintertime, or I can just dial this up and bring in more orange, and in that case it looks like somewhere in the Bahamas or somewhere else. So you can just change the mood of the image. If you don't like the result and you would like to go back to the default, pro tip, you just click here and the software resets this value, and any of those works the same. So if you would like to reset brightness, you just click here. Now if you would like to reset everything, you click here, the reset all option, but if you would like to only reset any of those options, you just click on the icon. Okay, and so I already covered exposure, so this is how it works in practice. So resetting all back to default, changing the brightness, this is how it works. Well, I forgot to show you one render style which I wanted, and that is the surfaces of these screens. Now those are special materials, not because of their texture, but because how they behave, and you will find a material called real emissive. Now we have a false emissive, that's for similar result, but for less powerful computers. Real emissive will actually behave as a light source. So if you just click and drag it over this screen, perhaps this other one, you will see a different result where you could tell that, yeah, those are monitors, those are having a nice bright effect. And if I would turn off all the light sources, those will really light up the scene, because those are actually now special light sources. Those are not created as light sources, those are created as materials, but those materials behave as light sources. So those are the real emissive materials for screens, advert surfaces, and so on. Okay, so I think I have covered pretty much everything that I wanted to talk about this time, and I wanted to show you how to switch to a final render, how to create, now we are working with low resolution renders, and we are talking about real-time rendering. But if I would like to change this, I can just select a different resolution. For the sake of speed, I won't do that now, but this is where you change it to the final version. And then you can also say that, okay, let's just go with an interior quick render. How does that look like? And in that case, the software will actually do a little bit more analysis. As you can see, you won't see the image right away. It takes a little longer, but all those grainy surfaces we had before, all those blotches that we have, those dark patches on the surfaces, they do disappear, because now the software considers more details. It is making a more precise calculation, to say the least. And as you can see, it takes even longer, even though we are only using a very small resolution for work resolution. And still, if I'm not satisfied with the brightness and the contrast and everything else, I can, even during render, I can change those. I can change the brightness. I think I will make it a little bit brighter with the exposure, and then I can change the brightness, contrast, and everything else. And when the result is done, I can just click on save, and I can save it in a PNG, JPEG, or anything else. The software offers PNG by default because it has a very good quality by default, and it's having a relatively good size. But if you would like to go with a JPEG, you can just save it as a JPEG. If you would like to go with a kind of good to go option, go-to option, I would recommend you to save in PNG, and later with any sort of, even with Paint, you can save a JPEG if you have forgotten. But if you would like to save the best quality, which is identical to what you saw on screen without any sort of JPEG loss, you should save the PNG, and then later you can decide what else you would like to do with that. Okay, so this is how it looks like. Now it will perhaps take like 2 minutes or so, and the work renders, the real-time drafts only took perhaps 10 or 15 seconds. So this is how large of a difference you will experience between rendering times when you simply increase the rendering quality from the lowest, from real-time rendering, to the middle, which is interior. So let's see, now we have this result. Let's just keep that in mind, that it was clear and it was nice, and we have all the details what we wanted to see. And let's check what would we achieve with an exterior quick render. Will it work for an interior? And let's just start it again. Now, the software did not restart it again. And in this case, it is kind of logical, because just imagine that you render for, I don't know, 10 minutes, half an hour, or an hour, and simply by changing something, it restarts render and you lose something because you have simply forgotten saving it. No worries, it won't restart itself automatically. If you change between the final renders, you need to restart it manually. So now I will render this visual using an exterior rendering setting, and let's see what the result will be. And actually, and this is what I wanted to highlight, exterior render, even though the name implies that it is for exteriors and it is really tailored for exterior renders, it is actually more accurate if we say it is tailored for well-lit scenes. And now our scene is very well lit. We have quite a lot of surfaces, light sources around us, so it will give you the same, nearly identical, same clear image just as the interior render would have created for you, but it will be faster. So it would be a bad habit to tell you that you should always go with the highest render setting and you will get the best result, because many cases when your scene is very well lit, you will have the same result or very, very identical, just with the lowest lowest production setting, which is the exterior quick render, and you will this will be perfect just as well. So you won't have to wait as long as I have waited before. It was nearly 1 minute, and before it was around 2 minutes, so it's kind of half the time. Okay, one other thing that I wanted to show you, and this is also a difference between the integrated render, I mean when it behaves as a window inside your project, and when it is kind of a standalone version of it. Because when it's a standalone version, you can actually close ARCHLine in the background. So you can save computing power by not using ARCHLine. When you have a complex scene, ARCHLine itself is also using CPU and RAM, so you can close it because now you have a separate rendering window, and whatever you already passed here, it will stay here. So you can just do the final renders. And another thing that you can do, because you are using this standalone render, is that the standalone version supports a so-called render list. Imagine that you would like to deliver all these renders that you have previously selected, set up how it looks like, I don't know, change the brightness and everything for that. For example, for this view now, what I'm rendering now, I have changed the brightness, the contrast, the exposure. I have fine-tuned it. I'm fine with that. And then I would like to terminate it, going back to this one, setting up the settings. I'm not willing to wait for the final results. I'm just willing to quickly set up the settings for all of these renders, and then let the computer do each and every renders step by step. So I don't have to stay there waiting for the render to be finished and then switch to another one and render. So what I do, I just switch a view, set up the settings, terminate rendering, switch to another view, set up the rendering settings, terminate, and then come back to the list and enable that, okay, let's just do this and this and this and start rendering. Instead of this one, you should initiate the render list with this button. So this will actually go and save and I mean render and save and render and save and render and save all the images. If you'd like to change where those images are saved, you can change it here. By default, they will be in the default ARCHLine.XP Draw 2020 render folder with the project name, so it's easy to find. But if you would like to change it, you can change it here either, or you can go to the rendering settings here, whichever you choose, you will see the same rendering settings. And actually, this is the only thing that I did not mention what this does. And this is you can specify the folder where you would like to save your renders in one go, so you don't have to change them one by one. Okay, so I think yeah. And finally, one more thing that I mentioned, and those are the exterior renders. Now, I don't need to switch to another project to be able to determine how that looks like and show you how that looks like. I can actually show you something interesting that you would consider doing for your projects, and those are the intersection renders. I mean, now that I have this model here, this is the full model. I mean, everything else is generated, whatever I see in the model, it is all surrounding me. But if I would like to create a 3D section for rendering, I can actually cut this model half by using this specific option. I clicked on this little arrow here, and I can use this create cutaway 3D view. How does that work? It works in a very simple fashion. You just click on one corner point and another one, and see, now this is the thing that I'm willing to keep. Everything inside this rectangle will be kept, and everything else will be cut out. So now what I will see is a half-cut model. It's like a doll view or something like that, a dollhouse view. And I like this, and I would like to even see that in render. But now because I have switched to the final render, it is not responding whatever I did. So now what I would like to do, I just would like to go back to the details and start real-time render either, or I can just simply start a new one. And now it still did not reflect the changes, so I need to either rebuild the 3D or just, I don't know, let's just move this a little bit so I can invoke a refresh to the render. So now I will see this half cut, or perhaps I have lost the connection. Sorry for that. I will just close this and initiate another one. So let's just go back and start rendering real-time draft. Yeah, everything is the same as before, and let's see how it looks like. Now, in case of exterior renderings, one key thing that you need to always check is well, first thing is the background, because now it looks a bit strange. Perhaps a regular color, like a let's just go with a single color, and like something like this. This is much better for this. So the background is important, obviously, and the exposure. Now here, if I'm looking from this angle, it is kind of okay. But if I turn the camera around and imagine that this is a building which I'm willing to render from outside, then everything is kind of white burnt, because now we have a lot of light source, a lot of sunlight hitting the surfaces of the sunshine. So the basic rule here is that when you do regular external renders, you need to usually dial down the exposure and then set up the rest. Now, because I'm willing to use this for a special version, a special render, like a side view or something like that, a perspective side view, let's just enlarge it like something like this, and I can even save this view, then this is what I will end up with. And also one more thing that I wanted to show you, can actually create kind of rendered elevations, rendered wall views, by simply using this option here on this little navigation bar. If you click on this option, you can select a right hand side view. And the reason I'm doing that, because now I'm seeing this model, and when you see the drawing in front of you, you should imagine yourself always standing here at the bottom of the screen. So in that case, this is the right hand side, which I'm willing to set up here. So I'm going back here and saying, okay, this is a right view. Okay, and then now let's see what happens here. So this is what I end up with. You can change the control, you can change the brightness, you can change the exposure, you can control what you see here on screen. You can save this, and you can also bring it into your plot layout as a rendered version of the other wall elevation views that you perhaps created, or the elevation views of your complex building. So this is basically what I wanted to talk about. We covered all of the settings for the rendering. We talked about how to change the render scene. Whenever I would like to go back to the full model, I just use the quick 3D model to rebuild it again, and I just go back to the one of my previous 3D perspective views, perhaps the one that we started with, and I think it was this one. And I can change the materials. So the key factors here is focus on the most important materials, enable content only that are necessary. And if you have a larger building and you have all these layers room by room, you can say that, for example, there is this office here, and I'm willing to render only this office, but not the rest of the building. Everything else that are in other rooms, I can disable. I can just simply not give to the renderer. So I can tell the software that I know that those won't be visible, don't even calculate them, so you won't lose time. So using the layer system, you can have very efficient renders, and just as I mentioned, with the rest of the settings, you can achieve certain type of goals that you would like to achieve, and you will end up rendered results with all the light sources, all the details, and all the fine shading that you wanted to create for your model. Let's see what sort of questions we do have. I think we have quite a few arrived, and okay. So if there was a question, let me see. What was the first one? Okay, there was one question. Update all instances. Yeah, well, I actually covered that. It was already covered in the session. Yeah, when you change a material, you change the material. You don't change the surface. You change the material. And if the material was applied anywhere else, it will be changed everywhere in your model, which is very convenient. You don't need to think, okay, did I forget anything? You just apply the surface material everywhere you would like to see, and you control the material, and you will control your whole visual. There was another question. I am trying a full HD render, and the render window, the size is showing as a smaller resolution. Why is that? Well, I can only imagine that perhaps this happens because so the thing that you need to check is that when you do the render, you should check what sort of resolution you see here. So when I'm closing this and I'm changing the resolution to anything else, initially when I start rendering, the render will start with this resolution. So it's not the screen that you are working with, it's the setting that you are setting up here. So if you just go and start rendering with this one, the initial render size will be this render size, but later, just as I mentioned, you can change it to anything else. There was another question about to do white render set to matte white, so we could only render shadows distribution. Well, for that sort of thing, I used to use the grayscale render when I actually don't change anything of my materials. I simply use the saturation. I just decrease the saturation to 0, so the colors, they're kind of psychological effect, whether I consider a yellow brighter than a red, won't change how I see the content in front of me. But you can also change the materials to something bright white. Perhaps for that you can also use the color cards. So you can set up color cards, and one version of the color card for each of your materials that you use could be the bright white material that you would like to use everywhere. And with this one, you can even kind of highlight things that you would like to. So you can say you can create a render with all white surfaces everywhere, but the things that you would like to focus onto, those are not white, but those are keeping their original material. And using the color cards, it is just one single switch for each of the materials, so it's very, very fast. Okay, if you want to create all white renders, yeah, that was the same question, and thank you for my colleague answering those questions also. And yeah, will be white, you can still differentiate. Yeah, that is also cool and good answer. Can we change somehow materials in the scene to a particular one in one click? Well, all the materials you cannot do in one click, because that's the main mechanism that works in the software, that you can change one material to another one. But I can show you one thing that is perhaps faster than what I show you, because now what I did here, it is based on what I can actually see on screen. If I cannot see something on screen, then how can I change its material? Now you don't even have to see the material in front of you, because we have an option for that, and it is, let me think where this option is placed to. Yeah, it's this here, the modify substitute material. If you click on that, the software will ask you to select the material that you would like to change, and then when you hit OK, you will see this dialog coming up again, and the software will ask what is the material that you would like to change it to. So if you know that your model contains 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 materials, you can just go through. It's like a list. You can go through and you can just use the substitute material and switch materials from one material to another one. Okay, so that is how it goes. And there's another question. When using RoomMaker after setup elements are shown in wireframe, well, I did not use the RoomMaker here, but RoomMaker is actually based on the RoomMaker setting, so it can be a different setting than what I used here. But whenever you would like to control what you see in front of you in a certain way, you can always control it here. So should it appear in hidden line removal, should it appear in grayscale or X-ray or whatever, you can just click here and say you would like to see. What I'm used to use is not the realistic, because in case of the realistic, I have some tone shading. Most of the time I actually use consistent color, so I won't see reflections, I won't see tonal changes, and this I usually use for my clients when I talk about the colors, because many of your clients, perhaps they won't understand how the software represents surfaces, and they will just say, okay, we didn't talk about this color, right? This is what we talked about, and I can see a different color. So you can tell, okay, when you do the renders, those are affected by the light sources, but these are actually the same color. So this is what I use when I communicate color design. Okay, yeah, I think now I have covered all the questions. I think, yeah, if I forgot to answer anyone, I hope not, but if I forgot to answer anyone, or you should you have any other questions watching this show later when it's not live, just comment below, or send us an email to info@ARCHLine.XP.com, and we will forward it to the person responsive to your question, and you will get an answer. And also, I'm happy that you were all here and you were so active and having all those questions. This is the last session for this starter workshop series of 7 or 8 episodes from the start to the end for interior design course. So this is the 7th and last part. We will start an intermediate course 1 week later, so not the next week but the week after. You will get an information about that, and I hope you will be able to attend that, and you will have a lot of questions, and you will be active as you were active today. So thank you again. This was the 7th part of this show, the rendering. We will come back with the intermediate course, and until that, have a nice day. And if you would like to, you can download the trial version of the software, and you can also test it for yourself. And yes, one another thing, talking about the sessions that I was about to tell you, you need to go to www.ARCHLine.XP.com. You need to come to webinars to be able to see the upcoming events, and the first one will be the 4th of May, 11 a.m. just as today, and it will be about the materials. So we will talk about way more about materials and how to fine-tune them, and you will learn kind of best practices that you can apply for certain type of materials, especially those shaded materials for curtains, light sources, around the light sources, and even certain type of textiles and mirrors. So we are there for you in the next series of 8 different intermediate course sessions. See you there, and if you like this video, just give us a thumbs up, and we will see you next time. Thank you very much.